Rob Granetstein is a rarity. He got into journalism very young, as a teenager. From there, his career just went straight up. Columnist, editor, editorial board member, now senior producer on Canada.com, new media. This is what makes Rob Granetstein a master of the art of journalism. Rob, thanks very much for being here. You know, I'm reminded, because you're the guest, that the ILO, the International Labour Organization in Geneva, defines journalist as anyone involved in the dissemination of information. Kind of a broad job description. Does that ring true for you?
Pretty much anybody can be in the media right now. So I think the definition is wildly different than it was even 18 months ago.
Is there a big demarcation line between those who subject their reportage to an editor or are vetted, as some organizations say, and those who don't, those who just put it out there?
I think there is, but there still is a level of talent that isn't working for an editor that is pretty strong too. That said, if someone writes something for the LA Times or the Toronto Star or for the National Post, you start with a bigger audience because they have people who just generally come to your paper, website, to your paper, however you want to put it. So they do have a bigger audience, but I don't think it matters anymore. I think if you have an editor or not, it gets edited, you know, almost by the world. That if you make a mistake in social media, they correct your mistake very quickly. I was talking to an editor from New York a couple nights ago, and he said, yeah, a lot of our stuff doesn't go up on the web edited, but when we make a mistake, we have a huge audience and we know about it quickly and we fix it quickly.
Now, if one wants to have influence on the public debate or on public policy, being a journalist is not a bad spot. Being the head of government is not a bad spot either, but being a journalist is pretty good. I'm given to believe that it is the whipsaw effect between so-called new media or social media or self-blogging or self-identification of a journalist, and then the mainstream media picking it up. So some people are interviewed because they're well-known bloggers or website managers, and some mainstream media people are asked to go on a website or a blog. What's your view of that symbiosis?
I think you're right. I think it's all over the map though right now. That really, people with a big name columnist in whatever city you're in, always has a big audience, and you can judge that audience by just notoriety in the town. You can judge that audience by the number of Twitter followers. You can judge that audience by the number of page views on the internet for their columns. There's all different ways to judge it, but if you're starting at big media, you're usually starting with some pretty good heft behind you. But there are other ways now to get that heft going and to build up.
Now, if you were my editor, you might rightly criticize me for having buried the lead, because we got onto that topic, which I think is really interesting. What is journalism? What's new media? But I want to go back to your personal story. My recollection is that you got into journalism very young. Can you tell us about that in a couple of sentences?
Yeah, I started at the Toronto Sun. I went in for a tour as a first-year university student and didn't leave for 17 years.
They wouldn't let you, or what was
They really wouldn't let me. I tried to leave a couple times and they kept promoting me, offering me better gigs. So I started out, you know, as a volunteer. I became, you know, basically the coffee runner. And then I was the proofreader, and then I was a weekend reporter, and then I was on staff as a general assignment reporter. I covered City Hall for 3 years, and then I got promoted to editorial page editor and ran the voice of the paper for both the Toronto Sun and for all of Sun Media across the country. And I did that for 5 years before leaving, and now I find myself running Canada.com, which is a news and discussion website for Postmedia.
Wow, lots of fodder for discussion. So let's go back to being a workaday journalist. How many journalists have a beat like you had, City Hall, or the old cliche, the police beat or the crime beat, and how many by definition are generalists who are assigned whatever the story is of the day?
I think it's changing, and I really think it depends on the newspaper. The bigger newspapers all have beats and all have people really pushing specific parts of whether it's a city or their game or whatever. And when you get to the smaller papers, generally they're all jack of all trades. That, you know, on a Friday night they could be covering the hockey game, and on the Tuesday morning they could be at City Council.
Because when I worked at Small, operations, and they said, who's the police reporter? I sort of stifled the phone and burst out laughing, as if we had those kinds of resources. So if you're pitching a paper, I guess you should ask that pretty obvious question. Do you have a reporter who covers X? Because I'm involved in X and I want to pitch a story to that reporter. Those basic questions are acceptable, I assume.
They are acceptable. I would say you should be doing a little homework before you call up, because if you're in an industry, whether it's pharmaceuticals or media or at City Hall or in that sphere, you should know who's covering you. And quite frankly, if the media organization that's covering you isn't clear on who it is, then they're making a mistake too, because they want their reporters to be known so that people will call them.
Well, yeah, read the paper and
read the paper is a great idea.
Yeah.
Read the websites, because that little bit, it's always good to contact a reporter directly, because then the reporter can go to their editor and say, hey, I was just talking to this source in whatever industry, and I think I have a story for you. Reporters always look smarter if they can go to their editor with stories.
Now, the Toronto Sun is known as a tabloid, not a British tabloid, sort of tabloid light, a nice, comfy Canadian version of a tabloid, but can be read on the subway with one hand. It's not a great big broadsheet that you have to know gigantic origami to be able to read. How is that a different outlet to pitch or interact with if you're a newsmaker? Is it merely that the stories are shorter, or what is it?
Sometimes it's also tied up in the brand. Like a Toronto Sun is not really interested all that much in stories on childcare, or their health beat is much smaller than a bigger paper like the National Post, the Star, the Globe and Mail. They just don't do that sort of stuff, and they're looking more salacious. Where the Star, the Globe and Mail here in Canada, I'd say they're also doing sort of public use journalism, and the Sun is, like you said, little Canadian, little conservative, but still trying to be a tabloid. So if they can't put it in an 80 to 100 point headline and make it sizzle, they may not do it. So you've got to pick your audience.
But Joe Lunchbucket, Joe Sixpack, and the donut culture, those people who read The Sun, just to engage in cliches, they also have children. They care about their children's health. They care about their own health. Why would those stories be almost automatically rejected?
They do care about all those things, but I think the feeling when I was at The Sun was that they can get that somewhere else, that audience that specific newspaper has is largely male, and they're really tailoring it to a largely male audience. They're doing a lot of crime, they're doing a lot of City Hall, they're doing a lot of overspending at City Hall, and they're doing a lot of courts, because they're interesting stories. But the childcare stuff, I remember having an editor tell me, we don't do that here. We just, where's the meat in that? Mm-hmm. And I think there is a spot for it. They've just decided that in their brand, and they need to know their brand they feel is a Sunshine Girl, is the best hockey coverage in the city, and is the best paper to stand up for the taxpayer. So knowing your audience is really important.
And then you have the columnists who either are or would like to be or are pretending to be larger than life media stars and competing with each other.
Yes, and the columnists, especially at a paper like The Sun, drive that paper. They are reporter and columnist at the same time. So they are, giving you the news and the opinion, which is a difficult thing to do, but they are front and center. They are driving the paper, and if you want big play, you need to be in with a columnist.